let's get the next panel to come up and take your seats. And while you do that, I'm going to introduce the moderator, Professor Alex Klass, and then we'll be ready to proceed into the next segment where we're going to have everyone who's going to answer a lot of questions that were posed at the beginning of the day. What are the right rules and how do we get the rules right? So Alex Klass is a very distinguished, she's a distinguished McKnight University professor here at the University of Minnesota Law School. She teaches and writes in the area of energy law, environmental law, natural resource law, tort law, and property law. Her recent work, published in many of the nation's leading law journals, addresses regulatory challenges in integrating more renewable energy into the nation's electric transmission grid, citing an eminent domain issue surrounding interstate electric transmission lines and oil and gas pipelines, and applications of the public trust doctrine in modern environmental law challenges. Prior to her teaching career, she was a partner at Dorsey & Whitney, law firm, well-known law firm here in Minneapolis, where she specialized in environmental law and land use litigation. There's much more about her accomplishments, of course, in the program bio. And I'll just mention she received her BA from the University of Michigan and her JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School. So with that, we'll bring up Alex Klass. Everybody's here.
Thank you, Ellen. It's great to be here, and this has been just a wonderful conference so far. The title of this panel is The Rules Matter, so this is our law and policy panel. And the panel will look at a broad range of federal, state, and regional laws and policies governing energy storage. These include mandates on electricity providers to develop energy storage, rules governing energy storage valuation, how we define energy storage, and some of the key barriers to development and implementation of energy storage technologies. A major opportunity associated with integrating energy storage into the electric grid is the ability of energy storage to cut across energy generation, transmission, and distribution. But this is also a major challenge. Federal law, state law, and regional actors regulate generation, transmission, and distribution quite differently. So this raises unique issues associated with how we define energy storage and, once it's defined, how to regulate it, promote it, and integrate it into energy markets. We've got a great group of panelists to discuss these opportunities and challenges, and I'll introduce all of them now. First, we will have Hari Asofsky, my colleague and a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. She'll provide an overview of the broader national legal context for energy storage, addressing some of the complexities of defining energy storage as it cuts across traditional divisions between generation, transmission, and distribution. She'll draw some comparisons between the different state, federal, and regional jurisdictions that are regulating energy storage today. Then we will have John Tuma. Commissioner Tuma was appointed to the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission by Governor Mark Dayton in February of 2015. Commissioner Tuma will discuss some of the barriers in Minnesota that currently suppress the true value of storage and some ways to address those barriers. Next, Rao Konandena is a senior manager for transmission asset management operations at MISO. Rao will discuss MISO's work on enhancing market rules to attract non-discriminatory participation by energy storage in MISO's electricity markets. Steve Dahlke is a policy associate at the Great Plains Institute. He'll discuss RTO power markets and market reforms that are relevant to energy storage. Last, Seth Mullendore is a project manager for the Clean Energy Group in Montpelier, Vermont. He's an analyst and technical advisor on their Resilient Power project. Seth will discuss energy storage valuation and some of the difficulties associated with valuing energy storage. We'll have each presenter speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. I may ask a question of the entire panel to start off the questions, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please write it on the note cards on your table. It will be brought up to the front, and I'll ask as many of them as we have time for. And I'm going to leave a couple minutes at the end for closing thoughts from each of the panelists so they can kind of bring together some of the discussion and the Q&A. So with that, we'll start with Hari.
So I'm going to give another big thank you to Ellen as well as a thank you to Alex, and I will try not to pour my water all over the floor. I'll just put it over. So I've been given an intriguing challenge, which is that I'm supposed to, in 10 minutes or less, cover all of energy law and policy nationally related to energy storage. And so as a consequence, I'm going to have to go, and I'm going to try to not speak like a policy debater, which means that I can't do a deep dive, so this is going to be a surface dive, but I think it'll help frame the conversation of the rest of the panel where we have some deeper dives into some of the specific things relevant to Minnesota. So what I want to cover today are really four main things. First, I want to just dig a little bit into that idea that Alex just raised of the complexities of matching law with the realities of energy storage. I want to talk a little bit about some of the federal action that's been taking place, some of the regional level action that's been taking place, and state action that's been taking place, and some of the things to think about on the road ahead for Minnesota. So, starting with the complexities of energy storage. So the problem is twofold. One is a substantive problem, which is that, you know, if you teach energy law, right? I mean, forget the fact that the energy system, full stop, is deeply fragmented in the United States, right? So we have different laws for each source of energy. We have different laws for electricity and transportation, the primary systems that use energy, right? And then we have a divide between environmental and energy law. So the only way that the Obama administration on the transportation side could simultaneously regulate tailpipe emissions and motor vehicle fuel efficiency was by having joint environmental and energy regulation, right? Because fuel efficiency is energy and tailpipe emissions are environmental. So against the backdrop of that system, one of the other subdivisions we have legally is between generation, transmission, and distribution. And there are often very different cost structures in the law around those three things that then become an issue when you're dealing with storage technologies that might fit into more than one category at the same time. And so one of the challenges for law, and this is something FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has been thinking about, is how do you, and a number of states have been thinking about, is how do you deal with the multifaceted nature of energy storage? This occurs at the same time as another challenge, which is that, and this is a challenge facing the whole energy system, not just energy storage, but that we have sort of a multi-level governance structure in the energy system. And in theory, right, we have interstate regulated federally and within state regulated at state level, with then the ISOs and RTOs created in between. As everybody in the room knows, in reality, it's a lot messier than that. And one of the things we're seeing, for example, in Clean Power Plan implementation, and I'm doing some work with Hannah Wiseman thinking about sort of these regional complexities, is one of the problems of the Clean Power Plan is you're taking a system that has a traditional state-federal model and trying to lay it over a system where energy markets function regionally for the most part. And there are a lot of complexities in doing that. I mean, forget all the politics and everything else about the Clean Power Plan, right? So when we think about energy storage and the legal and regulatory mechanisms, part of why we have to do this multi-level analysis I'm going to do is because you have to think about how these different actors are interacting with energy storage simultaneously across generation, transmission, distribution, which is a very tricky thing. So I want to highlight two things about federal action. I think most of the time when people talk about regulation at a federal level, right, when they talk about federal action, they're thinking about FERC. They're thinking about FERC's regulatory action, and that's a good thing to think about because FERC's regulatory action is playing a huge role in shaping sort of the barriers and opportunities for energy storage. But I think it's also important to think about the fact that another role that law plays is about financial incentives. So for example, when my students were doing a legal analysis last semester around freeway capping projects, a big part of the legal analysis wasn't just sort of the property law stuff and the land use stuff, it was also looking at where are the legal opportunities to get money. And so I just want to talk about both of those briefly. So FERC has had a number of orders that are relevant to energy storage, more than I have here, but I want to highlight these four because I think they show the progress over time in the same way we were hearing about sort of the California progression a moment ago. So really I think the first big moment to think about is Order 890 in 2007. Because that clarified that non-generation resources, and that included energy storage, could provide ancillary services. Another big moment that got a lot of attention, and that's really relevant to MISO, as we'll hear about in sort of the presentation on MISO, came in 2011 with Order 755, because part of what it did was it essentially changed the compensation structures in ISR RTO frequency regulation markets. The way they were structured before was not taking in sort of true costs. And so by taking into true cost better, it made technology like flywheel and battery storage become more competitive. Order 784 in 2013 basically sort of did a whole bunch of things that I probably don't have time to explain since I'm at 5 minutes, but it essentially eliminated a number of additional barriers to energy storage around ancillary services, including non-RTO regions in some of what it was doing as well. And then finally, Order 792 deals with small generator interconnection procedures, and that's another place where storage needs to be integrated. The key takeaway from this is that FERC gets that energy storage is important, and part of what it's been trying to navigate is how, within its authority, it can sort of bring together and recognize the different pieces of energy storage and really make it so that there aren't legal barriers to these emerging markets. That the way markets are structured really allow this technology to sort of move forward better. In addition to FERC's actions, there have been a lot of different incentive programs at federal levels. These 6 aren't all of them, and there are lots of ones happening at state and local levels as well. So what I really just wanted to highlight about this is that there's a lot of money out there trying to go into developing these technologies, and not just at sort of, at the different stages, from the primary research stages all the way up through kind of how do you bring it to market. And so there are real opportunities at a federal regulatory, sort of at a federal agency level, to tap into various resources around energy storage that way as well. Now, I struggled with whether to separate out regional action from federal action, because of course most of the important regional action, particularly in our region, is in our regional transmission organization, MISO. For those of you unfamiliar, and I think most people in the room probably know what an RTO is, but they basically emerge from a series of FERC orders and the role that they play in the majority of the United States now is managing wholesale energy markets. And MISO, so we have a multi-state RTO, MISO, that I'm not going to go into because we're going to hear about in depth in a moment. But the key thing to recognize is that these RTOs are also playing a crucial frontline role because, of course, how the markets get managed ends up mattering a lot to energy storage opportunities. So MISO's done some important studies in this area and has a number of different kinds of projects. And a lot of entities who are members of MISO are also doing innovative things. So I wanted to highlight, for example, the Indianapolis Power and Light Company, because in June 2015 it announced the development of the first grid-scale energy storage array in the MISO region. Finally, as we start to move into Minnesota, and the speaker after me is talking about Minnesota in particular, right? So my job is to kind of frame it all up. There are a lot of state models to look at. So California is certainly one of the most well-developed models, an important model to look at. Texas also has sort of utility, has had legislation that's in place for a while, and so provides another example. They, of course, have different RTO structures than we do. But there are also states that have done really interesting experiments in distributed storage. New York has an interesting experiment. Florida has an interesting one in sort of a post, a lot of these happen around disaster relief efforts as well. And so the main takeaway message I want to say on state action, since I don't have time to talk about any of these examples, and at least we got to hear about the example of California, yeah, I know, we have 1 minute, is just to say that there are a number of state models to look at, but it actually hasn't gone that far at a state level, which means that we have a real opportunity here in Minnesota for leadership nationally on these issues still, particularly because, I really believe in this sort of Garrison-Keillor, we are above average here, right? And that often makes us a model for the rest of the United States to follow because we do things that are above average rather than way out there, like California, right? And particularly in the Midwest region, we can really serve as a leader. As you know, Wind goes right down the center. We have a lot of solar capacity. So there are real opportunities for leadership here. And so the place I want to leave you with, so that I don't get in trouble for being over time, is basically that, that as we think forward to the road ahead for regulatory efforts, I think there are three crucial things that they can do. They can help address this mismatch I was talking about in the beginning between the legal system and all the different things that energy storage are, the way it cross-cuts generation, transmission, distribution, and levels of governance. Law can play an important role in providing incentives and supports for efforts to develop the key technology. And it also, there are real opportunities to coordinate law and policy across regulatory levels as part of a broader energy system transition. And so with that, I'll leave us there so that I don't get in big trouble, and just say, and turn it to our next speaker to focus in on Minnesota in particular and the barriers and opportunities here.
I'll gladly concede some of my time. I guess I'm here to prove that Garrison Keillor was wrong, maybe that we are not all above average, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the barriers. I didn't bring any visual aids. I learned early on as a lobbyist and a legislator that they're dangerous, particularly going in front of the Senate. It's impossible to use them. So I learned long ago not to bring PowerPoints to events. So I guess I'm the living example of why regulatory agencies are a barrier before you. So simply put, Minnesota really is not at a place, I don't think, structurally, and I'm new, a little preface here so I can lower expectations. I've been on the commission 5 months. I told my fellow commissioners that for the first 6 months I can play dumb. So they all went off to NARUC, okay, and are learning things, and they left me behind to do this role. So I'm still in the 5-month, 6-month window of not knowing stuff. But what was great about staying here, Ellen, and I appreciate you allowing this, is I've had a chance to sit down with some of our staff and learn in greater detail where we are at in a lot of the storage stuff, because you sit as a commissioner, we only get the things as they've kind of flowed through the system quite a bit, and there's been years sometimes. I was just astonished when we got our first Xcel rate case that it was started in 2013, and we were just finishing it here a few months ago. We just did the reconsideration order, and it won't be finalized here till just before September. So if you think about that, 2 years to do a rate case, this process is slow. It does grind at a different pace, and there's your first barrier. When you're in front of a regulatory agency like us, it does grind very slow. And it's meant to grind slow because we want to make sure we're considering those things that we're entrusted with, which is a preservation of a reliable system that is cost effective for the consumers. Thankfully, the legislature has viewed us as a place that we are trying to be innovative, but in that kind of desire to be innovative, we often get lost in the immediate. And they just keep coming at us week after week. I see one of our staffers here, she throws things at me constantly. And so we're dealing with whatever that is in front of us. So it's hard sometimes to step back as regulators and play our quasi-legislative role. You know, you're quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative. I'm still looking for the quasi-place where I introduce my quasi-bill. Being a former legislator, I can't find it. It made it very simple for a country boy like me in the legislature. You take your bill and you stick it in a hopper. You know, and that was for us country. Anybody know what a hopper is around here? Any country boys out here? That was just a place where you drop the grain. So we kind of knew if you had your idea, which is the thing that legislators move on, you take it and you drop it in the hopper. I haven't found the hopper over at the PUC yet. Things come to us in a different flow and a different mindset. Well, what has been good, I think Ellen was be able to chance to sit down with Chris Valerila. I can never say his name right, but he came from the California PUC, wrote some of the white papers on this, and he sat down with me on Friday, had my tutorial, still up on my whiteboard, on how this all works. And one of the things that shocked me first was really the ancillary benefits that this brings to the grid. It was something that I as a regulator wasn't aware of, and I can tell you if I as a regulator wasn't aware of it, and I as a lobbyist who lobbied in this area was not aware of it, I can assure you most of the policymakers at the Capitol and around you don't understand all the other benefits that are built around this. So I think right now there's an information gap between the policymakers and the regulators of all the other benefits that exist for the grid. The other thing is we really not positioned ourselves well with our pricing structure. I've heard that and I understand that it's not all about the energy price, but we have not positioned our energy pricing in a way that can encourage more investments behind the meter and out into the community, because we really haven't built a price in there for consumers to understand that the energy they burn at 4 o'clock actually costs something different than the energy they burn at 4 in the morning or 4 in the afternoon versus 4 in the morning. And we have not made that price sensitive. We know that, we kind of understand that. We were told that when we want to conserve energy, but that was not something that is really price sensitive, such that I'm going to make a major investment in my energy portfolio that I'm somehow interacting with my energy company, or how I do that just the price is not there. I think other thing that is a barrier here in Minnesota, and it's not a bad barrier, it's just a reality. We've focused all of our energy, both from an advocacy standpoint and from a policy standpoint, around conservation and renewable energy. That's the big story. That's the story we've sold in Minnesota. I was a lobbyist for Conservation Minnesota, Minnesota Environmental Partnership. That was my job to sell it. I was a Republican lobbyist, so I had to go and sell it to Republicans, and so it was about convincing that this is jobs for Minnesota. That's what renewable energy is about. Conservation is the cheapest energy. The cheapest energy is energy we don't burn, so if we can build more and better homes and more and better buildings, we will burn less energy. That will be a positive for our economy, more jobs. That was the selling point. I think there's some synergy there that I'd like to talk about, but just simply put, we've designed a regulatory and a physical system that never believed it could actually store power. I mean, when you think about it, that was not on our radar screen when we were selling this years ago. We just didn't believe you could store power, even though I know others were doing that. I just think that the assumption was power cannot be stored. And so just to look ahead, I think kind of give you some signals of, I think, what maybe efforts to try to rethink Minnesota's system. Been watching or reading David McCullough's book on the Wright brothers, and I found it was interesting. Right when the Wright brothers were first testing their at the time glider back in 1901, the head engineer for the U.S. Army said, "We should just quit this whole flight experiment thing. It's the dumbest idea. It'll be hundreds of years before we can figure out flight." And so it's a challenge. I remember sitting at a meeting with other regulators from other states, and we were in a debate about, whether we should be doing more nuclear power or less nuclear power, and they're arguing that somehow we're going to figure out how to reuse waste, and that's going to be our new energy storage. And the statement was made by one of them that, we'll figure out the energy storage issue for our energy problem for nuclear power before we can make renewables baseload. And I confronted him saying, I think we're actually very close with storage and stuff to make that happen. And I'll bet, I did, I bet him that I think we'll figure out how to make renewables baseload long before we actually figure out how to reuse the waste that's sitting on the Mississippi River. And I think I'm encouraged by listening today that we are actually a lot closer. I was making that kind of out of, because I hate nuclear power, I was making that kind of out of bravado, and I'm somewhat encouraged that we actually are making some strides there. And so I think for a regulatory structure to work here, we first need collaboration. It's good to see that Xcel is thinking about these issues. I appreciate the efforts they've been making, but there has to be collaboration with our utilities. We have to know that it can work. Now, I always worry about utilities when they say they can't do it, because I remember trying to sell renewable energy back only a few years ago, and now they met their renewable energy standard, flying past the renewable energy standard we set for them several years ago, and all I heard is, wind doesn't blow all the time. Well, thank you. I think I'm smart enough to know wind doesn't blow all the time. That's not why we're doing it, but we've figured out how to make that happen where the utilities are now making progress, but we have to do it collaboratively. It was Xcel's leadership, I think, that really brought that renewable energy standard together years ago, and I think advocates need to be working with the utilities. We have some collaborative efforts going on right now, and they need to start integrating some of these ideas to make this more viable. I think also we should consider maybe, and I think it didn't succeed this last year, but I think what it is for us that moves forward is some goals. It's hard from the regulatory position to establish moving forward unless we have some assistance from the legislature, from our policymakers, from the administration. For us to succeed, where our little shop over the PUC only has 55 employees, we need some direction to be able to take that and use it broadly. We don't regulate everybody in Minnesota, and so that's part of the structure problem that we have. But it helps to have those standards or goals laid out, and then we can start turning those into power purchase agreements, start co-locating some of these facilities with solar. Those are the kind of things that we need to start valuing. If we can value what storage really means to the whole system, it'll be good. I think we talked about the Duluth project, the power line coming up from the Nelson River. That was all great, but they never really valued why that was good. We all said, oh, this is a good idea, it has value, but there really wasn't a value that was put to it, a number to say, this is why it's a good idea for this utility and why it's not. Another option is good. So that's good enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So from a MISO perspective, I'll show some of the rules and regulations. And I didn't get the memo that I shouldn't have any slides, so I do have a couple of them for your benefit today. So from a market platform, we run a wholesale energy market, and we are not in one state, unlike California ISO, we are in 15 states, and a city of New Orleans, and a coordination member of Manitoba Hydro. So that's what MISO is. In fact, we are the first RTO approved by the FERC back in 1999 when those FERC orders came about. So our market, wholesale energy market and ancillary service market, facilitates this non-discriminatory market participation because for us, it doesn't matter whether it is solar, wind, coal, nuclear. We have to be mindful of all the fuel types, and we also have to be mindful of locational aspects. They can come from any part of this footprint because membership is voluntary in these markets. So there is no rule out there that utilities should join an ISO or RTO that I know of. So utilities find it in their best interest to join ISO RTOs, and that's where we are. We also have new business sectors working with us these days. In the past, we had investor-owned utilities, we had independent power producers, we have end-use customers, we have organization of MISO states. Today, we also have independent transmission developers due to FERC Order 1000. So our stakeholder community is increasing. We have a lot of stakeholders at the table. As a result, we have a lot of stakeholder meetings that are open and transparent. And so as a result, I share the comment made by Commissioner Tuma earlier that our process is also slow. Just because of these different stakeholders, as well as our FERC tariff behind us, as well as different states. So I would like to keep that at the forefront of our market platform. In addition, one point I would like to raise up front also is with these different resource types, not only on the generation side, but also on the demand side, we have several products out there currently. These are products such as demand response resources that we call DRRs, and there are different types of them. Without going into the gory details about the market types, we do have incentives for them, whether it is an aluminum smelter like Alco has in Indiana, or whether it is other batteries like Leuven. We have those products out there for the market participants to bid into our day-ahead and real-time wholesale energy and ancillary service markets, just like other ISOs. Specifically for stored or energy storage, back in the day, someone mentioned Beacon. Beacon actually couple of years ago when they were started with us at MISO and led to this development of a product called Stored Energy Resource, SER, which is also available for energy storage products in our footprint. In addition to that, I had looked at the presentation that one of our colleagues here from the utility Minnesota Power gave around the transmission line in Minnesota Power from Duluth. So one of the reasons why that's such a great line for Minnesota is the external asynchronous resource, the EAR project, that was unidirectional to start with, but now it is bidirectional. So that's how that storage is enabled for our utilities here in Minnesota. And finally, the wind mandates that we went through in our footprint for quite a while, and roughly, I believe we have 13,000, maybe 13,500 megawatts of wind currently in our footprint today. We are projected to go almost to 25,000 in the next few years. Overall, all these mandates that we have in our 15-state boundaries relate to about 13% renewables for MISO. So we have wind happening a lot in our footprint thanks to those renewable portfolio mandates. So we have a good partnership with our states, organization of MISO states, to put together studies out there, like the regional generation outlet study, where we had planned the transmission expansion to accommodate that wind, and that's how we resulted in the multi-value projects, the $5.2 billion plan. So MISO has those partnerships in place from a planning perspective as well as from a market perspective, because one of the key attributes that we ran into from a wind perspective was the operators were curtailing wind manually, and that led to some consternations with the wind developers. So we now have wind as a dispatchable resource, so it is a dispatchable intermittent resource, a DIR. So before moving away from this slide, I would once again, key takeaway is we have different resource types out there in our existing market structure for both the demand side as well as energy storage and wind. I mentioned the stored energy resource product in 2010. That's how we started allowing those short-term resources, flywheels. At that time, that was the only technology that was commercial grade, if you will, available. Since then, we have had the participation in Iowa. There was Iowa Stored Energy Park. There was a compressed air storage project that caught our attention due to geological reasons that fell through. We still have Luverne, Minnesota. It's nice to see my colleagues from Excel that it's a functioning setup. We also have Ludington, the pump storage system in Michigan. So we have several storage resources that are current and existing in our footprint. On top of it, like you have seen earlier presentations, we have FERC orders that are coming out that would incentivize this behavior that they would like to see at a wholesale level, at a wholesale energy market construct. So Order 755 is one of those from 2012, which is trying to get to that regulation mileage payment. And last but not the least, in these orders, what we are finding out is we don't need as much fast ramping resources as they in Northeast, like PJM and New England need. Just because our footprint is so vast, we have 15 states, we have mostly base load. Yes, the fleet is changing currently with the Clean Power Plan impacts, but at the end of the day, the price is so cheap, 6 to 8 cents basically when you compare it to 40 cents out in the Northeast. So we are not seeing as much fast ramping resource need as you would expect. As a result, we are focusing more on what our current market and market participants need, which is the AGC enhancements, the automatic generation control on those fast ramping resources. So we have studies out there. We have a program called Market Enhancement Program that looks at the criteria of specific market enhancements that we would like to make. And it is being prioritized. This storage is a aspect that has been prioritized under the AGC enhancement. We are obviously under these programs from studies that we see with the current FERC Order 755. looking at the cost benefit as well. And we are finding out we have to make whole existing generation and their resources to accommodate these fast ramping resources. And as a result, we are incurring, or in fact the market is incurring a lot of savings and penalties as well. So it is key to understand in a market construct those costs will have to come from the market participants. If we pay one sector a certain segment of those costs, the other, it comes from the rest of the market. So we continue to perform those studies to understand more of those impacts, and I'll leave with the transmission planning hat that I have, which is we do see potential for grid scale storage, 10,000 megawatts and the like. Location, obviously, we don't know because that's part of the state processes. So our studies do indicate potential for storage, keeping in mind we do have lots of existing storage in our footprint, especially pumped hydro. So the pumped hydro storage, that's the Ludington, around 2,600 megawatts. The stored energy resource from Excel, the 1 megawatt, 7 megawatt hours, and as well as the recently announced IPL, Indianapolis Power and Light AES, set up around 20 megawatts is a good example for where we have current resources in our market, and my contact information for you. Thank you.
All right, I'm following in Commissioner Tuma's footsteps, and I didn't prepare slides today. I figure if I'm doing things that he's doing, I'm probably on the right track. I'm Steve Dahlke. I'm an associate at the Great Plains Institute. GPI is a Twin Cities-based nonprofit organization. We work locally, regionally, and nationally. We are, among many other things in the energy space, an active member in MISO's environmental sector. And so we're working with MISO's market engineers and planners and executive leadership and folks like Rao to advance our goals within the RTO process. One of which is to develop and implement enhancements to the marketplace that make the mid-continent region a more attractive investment environment for energy storage. Rao gave a nice overview of what MISO has done and is currently doing to facilitate the non-discriminatory participation of resources like storage. And I'm here to tell you that more can and should be done on that front. There's some enhancements that we're working on that would help move the market in a way that's more consistent with where technology and consumer preferences are evolving. First, I'll start by talking about distributed energy resources. We've heard discussion about this today, and every day I feel like on my daily news feeds there's at least one and usually multiple articles about DERs and how they're transforming the system and et cetera. In MISO, there's some rules that make certain aspects of investment in these resources more difficult. One of the business strategies for someone who's developing a DER or a distributed community storage project, for example, is to aggregate smaller components across the neighborhood or across different neighborhoods or across a certain region into one large resource that they can then offer into the to the system operator and make money in the wholesale market. We're seeing that in other parts of the country. There's projects in the Northeast, for example, that are aggregating electric vehicles to provide ancillary services. We see lots of demand response aggregation providing these services in other markets. And we're not seeing as much in MISO. One of the reasons is because of a relatively high threshold for size for a resource to participate in the market. To bid into MISO's energy and ancillary services markets, for example, you need to be at least 5 megawatts or greater, which is about 50 times larger than what some of the other markets in the East have for their minimum size threshold. The other piece to that is your resource in MISO has to be located in a single geographic spot. So that essentially makes aggregation impossible under current rules. If you're someone like Great River Energy, and we heard Jeff Haas talk about this morning, they're looking at aggregating electric water heaters. Rules like this in MISO make that a very difficult, if not impossible, investment to make. Getting up to the 5 megawatt threshold for a lot of distributed resources, including thermal or smaller scale battery storage, is difficult in that marketplace. So we've been working with industry partners and as well as the organization of MISO states have built up support for enhancements to the marketplace that would lower this minimum threshold, allow for aggregation, and hopefully make the marketplace more amenable to new emerging technologies like energy storage. Raul mentioned things don't move very fast in MISO. I've experienced that firsthand, but we're working on pushing these things through. Another promising enhancement that's been going on in MISO, and Raul referred to it, is a reform to their automated generation control signal, which for the operators is part of the mechanism by which they procure ancillary services to the grid. It's the automated signal that they'll send generators to tell them to ramp up or ramp down just a little bit to help keep the system in balance on a real-time basis. And so what MISO is talking about is establishing a separate category for fast ramping resources, which is a good step in the right direction. And primarily one of the issues for storage developers that want to provide this service in the MISO marketplace is simply that the prices just aren't high enough to make the investment pencil out in a lot of ways. You may look at low prices and think, okay, that's too bad for developers who want to make the money, but that's probably good for if you have a regulatory perspective, or if you're looking at it from a consumer's perspective, low prices is good. Well, in this situation, lower prices don't exactly equate to lower cost when you're providing ancillary services. What's happening in MISO and what historically has been the case is that these services have been provided by conventional generator units, primarily coal and gas, that don't respond as quickly as something like a battery or a flywheel could. But they can bid in at low cost, low price, so that's why the prices are low. However, the service that the operators are getting is not as good as what a battery can provide. So the signal goes out, MISO expects a response within seconds. They're usually getting responses within the range of minutes from these units, and oftentimes they're not accurately meeting their set points. And so this is not that big of a deal if you have high reserve margins, if you have 20, 30% like we've seen historically in MISO, but those reserve margins are coming down because a lot of these conventional units are retiring. So we're looking at a much more dynamic system, and things like the ancillary services markets become much more important in that type of environment. So one of the components to bringing in more investment in higher performing resources to help provide grid ancillary services is compensating them for their superior performance, and then we'll get the benefits back in other ways to the market, and on a net basis it'll be lower cost. MISO did an internal study that Raul referenced on one of his slides that concluded if they brought in 100 megawatts of fast ramping resources, they would see $10 million in annual production savings benefits by offsetting these slower conventional resources. One of the primary benefits that PJM has seen from bringing in the 100 megawatts or so of batteries that they currently have with more in the queue is that they've been able to reduce their operating reserve margin by about 300 megawatts. And that's an additional benefit on top of what MISO quantified in their additional study. So what that is you have higher performing resources, you need less of them to provide the same service. And there's cost savings and economic efficiencies to be had to the whole marketplace from doing that. So that's another enhancement that we're supporting. And finally, when we look at MISO and opportunities for storage, the last piece that we're keeping an eye on is using storage as a transmission system reliability asset. One of the other ways that a battery can provide value, like bacon, you can kind of put it anywhere and it's good. MISO does a lot of transmission planning. Each year they look and forecast out the planned generation that's on their system and model that and identify reliability and transmission issues in future years. So, for example, they might look at a planned wind addition in southwestern Minnesota and see that, okay, when this goes in 2019, we're going to have an overload on our system in this spot. And we'll publish those results and work with the transmission owners on their system in identifying a solution. And oftentimes that's a new transmission project. Well, most of the time, the reliability and congestion issues that MISO sees in their plans are typically related to overloading transmission lines. And in many cases, it's usually just a few hours of the year during peak conditions. Most of those situations, you could also put a localized battery in that spot that would absorb the power during those few hours a year and mitigate that need. And if you can do that at a lower cost than what it would take to build a transmission line, then that's the investment that makes sense from a regional perspective and a statewide perspective. So the other piece is we want to see cost allocation similar to how a transmission line would get cost allocated for other resources like storage if they can provide the same service at lower cost. And there's precedent for this in other parts of the country. And I am down to 30 seconds, so I will just stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So that made my job easier because that was a lot of the stuff that I was maybe going to have to get into that I didn't know if I had time for. So thanks for that, Steve. I do have slides, but I'm going to ask you can largely ignore them. I just kind of putting them up there so you have something to look at. So when you hear about value in energy storage, you hear a lot about revenue stacking. This is an example of revenue stacking here. That was a valuation of the value of solar and storage for Hawaii. But they actually didn't include most of the things in their valuation. And don't get too hung up on the specifics of these things because different people call them different things. Basically, storage can do a lot of stuff. Some people say it can do up to 30 different things. It can't do all those things at once, but when it's not doing other things, it can do a lot of things. And batteries in particular are very versatile and can serve a lot of functions. One of the problems is that no one entity controls all of these benefit streams. So these are broken up between utilities, grid operators, the actual owners of the energy storage, if it is not one of those, and possibly merchant operators as well, people that are using storage to provide revenue services, grid services. So it's very hard to monetize this in a way that you can have one party that gets all the benefits. It's very hard to structure this system. And I want to go back to something that Commissioner Tuma said, that a lot of the things that they were looking at with the Regulatory Commission, or the thing with his work, is you're always looking at conservation and renewable energy. And those things are great. I think we all agree. We like them very much. But what they don't directly address that energy storage can is this issue of peak demand. Peak demand keeps on growing, and it's growing every year. People are using less and less energy to produce more things, but we're growing in the amount of energy that we need to use. What energy storage can do is it can take the energy we're producing in one area and use it at a time when we're using less. So if we are using a more consistent amount throughout the day, then we don't need all this excess peak generation. And that's going to bring down the capital cost of the whole system. It's going to provide a lot of value. What energy storage can provide that a lot of other things can't is it provides flexibility to the system and it provides resilience to the system. So I'm just going to run through some charts here. And again, just kind of vaguely pay attention to them. This is from an evaluation that was done by the Brattle Group for a actually transmission and distribution grid operator in Texas called Encore. So basically, one of the other issues that we're seeing with energy storage that's a regulatory concern that we're going to have to deal with is who can own energy storage. So Encore wants to own energy storage, and they're not allowed to in Texas. This has been dealt with in different ways. In the California mandate, you have different carve-outs for different things. Utilities can own some, behind the meter, customers can own some other ones, and there are different targets for different sections. New York has a big reforming the energy vision, REV process that's going on. There, they only allow utilities to own storage in very limited cases. So that's one of the things that you have to deal with, in especially the deregulated markets. Anyways, this was Encore wanted to own storage, so they had a report that would show that it might be a good idea if they did. But this is basically a graph showing the total system-wide benefits of storage. And you can see, again, we have the stacking. So there's production cost savings. There's avoided capacity cost. That's basically saying we don't need to build out all this generation. That's a huge chunk. Then there's some production cost savings as far as fuel savings from fossil fuels, things like that. Then there's this deferred transmission and distribution. That's another huge chunk, which Steve was talking about. Sometimes it's cheaper to put a battery in a place where you have congested transmission and distribution. And it's much cheaper than building out and upgrading all these transmission and distribution lines. And there's some FERC orders, FERC Order 1000, mandates that you got to start looking at alternatives, but only some places are doing that right now. And then you have this avoided distribution outages. I talked about resiliency earlier. This is one thing that they put a value on. A lot of other places do not. And there is no market value specifically assigned to this. This study actually found that 30 to 40% of the value of energy storage was not accounted for in market prices. So they also looked at energy storage in other places. So you'll see the takeaway from this was they found that the cost to benefit ratio was maxed out at 5,000 megawatts. You still have it economical at 8,000, but it's declining returns at that point. So that's the total system-wide benefit, 5,000 megawatts. That's a lot of storage. We hear a lot about the frequency regulation market. In Texas, usually it's about 1% of peak demand, and I think in Texas that would be around 600 or 700 megawatts. So just a small fraction of this. They also looked at what are the customer-wide benefits. So if it was structured in a way that customers benefited from lowering their utility bills or keeping their utility bills flat, where would they max out? And here again, you can see that it's cost beneficial at their price point. I should know too, I forgot to note too. This is at $350 per kilowatt hour. We're not there yet. This is projected for 2020. Tesla came out with some numbers for their power pack that's at about $500 per kilowatt hour. That's for installed costs. So we're getting there, but we're not there yet. And a lot of them are more around $1,000. But in the future, this study is saying, okay, for customers, they can see a flat rate at around 3,000 megawatts. Again, that's a lot higher than Texas has right now. It's a lot higher than they're going to see under their current system. And they need to figure out a way to wrap all of these benefits into a way that can be monetized. Then they looked at the merchant value. And this is where some third party goes out and they say, we're going to build a battery and we're going to provide grid services and get money for that. We're going to find services to customers and we're going to get money for it. You can see that the break-even level is much, much lower. It's around 1,000 megawatts, a little bit lower than that, because they've got to get some return on their investment. So if you leave it just to the market system for markets that don't even exist in Texas right now, this is about what you're going to end up with. So we've got a problem there. We've got all these benefits, and we've got all these different parties, but it's very difficult to find a way that will maximize that total system benefit to get to that 5,000 megawatts that the study found was beneficial. And study after study, I'd actually really like to see the Minnesota one that you were talking about, Janice, so please send that to me. Study after study is finding the same thing, that the problem that we have is that we don't have the proper way to value these in a way that everybody can take advantage and needs to take advantage. Last, I just threw up this slide. This is what we're talking about. This is what one of the projects is talking about. There's an energy storage project in Maine by Convergent Energy. So, you know, storage isn't the most fun thing to look at sometimes. It's basically a big box, and you got a bunch of batteries in it. You can't show windmills in a field. You can't show, you know, solar panels out in a field. But that's what energy storage looks at. It's not always pretty, but it works. So this is the transmission and distribution cost. This was to put in Booth Bay, Maine. They had a bit of transmission and distribution that was congested, and the cost of this battery, the cost of this project, was 80% lower than what it was going to cost to upgrade the transmission distribution lines, which is what a utility would normally do if they didn't look at the alternatives. Another project in New York by Con Edison is doing a similar thing. They're doing a demand response program, which a lot of energy storage is bidding into. They're paying people to use their batteries instead of drawing from the grid, and because of that, they're reducing the congestion they have on transmission and distribution. Once again, it's costing about 1/5 the price of what the actual project would cost. So,
I have a factoid.
yeah.
Just to underscore my point that utilities, once they learn about this, they become the biggest champions. The founder of Convergent used to do strategic planning at Southern California Edison and was in charge of like their whole opposition to storage during the AB 2514 That's true.
All right. So, people can change. People can see the light. There's a lot of details people have gone over here. I'm going to go ahead and stop and just let's hear some questions, and thank you for listening.
Thanks to all of you for great presentations. We have several questions and we have a decent amount of time. So I'm going to start with a question that I have for the whole panel, and all of you can answer or you don't have to answer, but it's on coordination. So how important is it for federal, state, and regional actors to coordinate policies on energy storage? So among states, are there problems with states having very different policies within an RTO? On a vertical level, from state to federal to regional, how much coordination does there need to be between FERC at the federal level, RTOs at the regional level, and the states? Or is it better to have a variety of approaches at the state level so they can act as laboratories of democracy, and so that different RTOs can experiment with different market approaches to energy storage that then FERC can learn from and potentially either adopt or promote? So thoughts that you have on that? Maybe start with Hari.
Thanks, Alex, for the interesting question. I just want to acknowledge one more person in the room. I did thank yous earlier around the conference itself, but I just wanted to acknowledge Danielle Meinhardt, a recent STAR graduate of the law school who did a lot of research on energy storage law, compiled, I think, about 100 documents. So anyway, just wanted to sort of say hi and thanks. On the coordination question, I think the answer, as it is to many things, is it depends. Right? So I think there are certain, first of all, there's certain coordination that automatically needs to happen because, you know, between FERC and RTOs, for example, right? I mean, and this is like the example of Order 755. A number of things that FERC does are sort of mandating things for RTOs, and then RTOs are going to come up with different solutions, in part because they're structured differently. So I don't I mean, I think that there's a certain level of uniformity that gets created by the FERC-RTO relationship, and a certain amount of divergence because, you know, RTOs are in this weird status. They're sort of public things because they're FERC authorized, but they're also have mostly private entities as members, and so that, I think, really influences the level of coordination. On a state-to-state basis, similarly, I think it depends as well. I think you're right that sort of the laboratory of democracy approach works to the extent that different states are going to come up with different solutions that match their energy needs and their energy markets, and that's fine. But on the other hand, there are certain interstate industries for which having a uniformity of standards is important, and particularly when you get divergences, you know, in an industry that cuts across states, particularly if you have local ordinances. I mean, we haven't talking much in this panel about local, but earlier someone referenced, for example, how New York laws, you know, New York City laws were really sort of hampering a lithium-ion project, right? So if you have divergences in local laws that then mess up state efforts, that can be a problem too. So I think, you know,
the coordination isn't always important, and that you do want divergences, but there are certain levels of coordination that create functionality that you really need in the system.
Yeah, basically I agree. That last point was a good one about the fire safety codes, because I'm dealing with this on an intimate level that I'm not happy about in New York. Is that, yeah, if we had a national standard for fire safety codes for putting lithium-ion batteries in buildings, that would be great. Then we wouldn't have all these problems. That's one of the soft costs of energy storage as far as behind the meter goes. That is such a problem because these are not standardized. So every time you want to do one of these projects, you have to go through a lot of red tape and you have to talk to a lot of people. And a lot of people have to sit around and have meetings, and it takes a long time. Ideally, I think there would be this coordination at all levels. There is a lot of support for demonstration projects coming from the federal level, and FERC rules are enabling a lot of these markets to open up and start to be formed, and that's great. But also, that stuff takes a long time. So we need to be hitting at it from both ends. I talk to a lot of developers, and they're finding ways to do these projects regardless of what the environment is. Now, at some point, and I think we're very close to that point, energy storage is going to step out of this one-off project basis. I've said at other times, and I'll say it again, energy storage is where solar was 10 or 15 years ago. It's still in that one-off demonstration phase, and it's ready to expand beyond that. In order to have that, we're going to have some kind of consistency. We're going to have a pipeline of projects that are ready to go, and we can say, yes, I've seen that before, I know how to deal with that. All I have to do is check off these boxes, and it's done. I don't have to change which boxes I check if I'm in this town or this state, or I'm in this state. So, yes, we're going to need coordination on all levels.
Even though I think that it'd be nice to coordinate with the federal government on some of the things, the federal regulatory agencies, I think Minnesota, I think particularly Minnesota and Iowa, probably in the Midwest have more benefits to gain from figuring out the storage end of it because of the available abundance of renewable energy and not the desire to burn more coal as some of our neighbors to the west have. And so if we can start figuring out how to take advantage of some of these pricings that make sense for some of the projects that we have, I think Minnesota will benefit more from it than our neighboring states. So if we try to wait for coordination, we may miss out on some opportunities that Minnesota can lead on. We were leaders on the renewable energy standard up in the Midwest. Everybody else followed. Now, if we can make sense of how to make this work from a standpoint of turning some of those renewable assets more into a baseload looking like energy source and get all the other ancillary benefits to it, we will push the rest of the market in MISO and other areas to make those work, because frankly we wouldn't have got anywhere if it wasn't for pushing some of those renewables down the road that we did in the other years. And I think that's where Minnesota needs to kind of position itself. You always hate to be the leaders and take some of the risk, because even though this all sounds good, we don't know in fact whether it's going to all pan out, because the price of batteries hasn't come down to a point that makes total sense yet here from a energy cost standpoint. But if there's other things that we can start to figure out to give value to it, I think Minnesota has more to benefit from jobs and the source of energy being right here.
We're in a region, including Minnesota, where the states have more authority over proving and building electric resources than in other parts of the country that are more deregulated. When you look across the big regional market, that may probably provide some challenges to an entity like MISO, having lots of different states moving potentially in different directions. But on the flip side of that, if groups like the Organization of MISO States and commissioners from across the region can keep a healthy collaboration with MISO in the development of that marketplace, I think there's advantages to having that sort of construct as well. Both that would allow states to meet their goals that they want for their state, as well as letting states extract value and revenues from the regional market. To give one example, for those of you following the demand response industry, there's significant legal uncertainty at the federal level over what's going to happen with demand response that's in regional wholesale markets, particularly out east. There's a fair amount of uncertainty with the gigawatts of assets that are participating out in PJM. That's not really an issue that we're facing here in MISO, because while there's significant demand response in our region, there's about 6 gigawatts of demand response registered with MISO. Almost all of those resources have registered with the approval of the respective state. So the question at the federal is should these demand-side assets be regulated by FERC or by the states? That's not really an issue here in the Midwest, because it has approval from the states and it has approval from FERC in how they're operating currently. So there are some benefits to having a strong state and regional collaboration.
Yeah, just a thought. We do have experience with working with the different states, the organization of MISO states. We do have test cases that we have run so far about the renewable portfolio standards, work with the Upper Midwest Transmission Development Initiative, UMTDI, as well as the cost allocation regional planning groups, as well as I believe Minnesota has something called CBED, Community-Based Economic Development. So we do have a lot of collaboration with the state and state agencies within our planning process, and so that's essentially the key for this coordination effort.
Great, thank you all. So this question is for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it, and it's, are the policies and regulations in Europe and elsewhere more or less helpful in encouraging storage projects and reaping their benefits?
I can kind of answer some of that. And mainly it depends, because there's a lot of different policies in different areas. Germany is a place with a lot of solar, and everybody knows they have very aggressive solar policies. They also are implementing pretty aggressive storage policies as well. So they're incentivizing a lot of self-consumption, both through incentives directly at storage and reducing the feed-in tariffs that they have for solar. Because their energy prices are so high, it's kind of a no-brainer for some people to put storage along with solar systems. There are other places, like I recently saw Spain was trying to impose a fee on some of the rate structures that did not allow people to use storage and consume their own energy. There was a very big fee for that. I think they're dialing back on that, but that's an example of a regulation that is not helpful at all. And so there are instances on both sides. In general, energy prices are more in European markets, which leads to more self-consumption on the behind-the-meter side, and there's more promotion for that.
Great, thank you. This question, I think, is for Rao, which is, how is storage included in the transmission planning process? More specifically, is storage modeled as a potential solution for transmission deferral, or is it only modeled as a generator providing ancillary services?
Good question. So currently, please remember I said Ludington and other pump storage resources are in our footprint, and so they are modeled in our existing planning networks. We do see a lot of potential to update our models using production cost models such as Plexus that can model the intra-hour dispatch. So we are in the process of revamping some of those production cost models to delineate the value streams like mentioned today for storage. I think there was a question also on the ancillary service benefits, if I understood right, in terms of our planning context. So once again, we do model those, but the price is not there in the market construct, as well as our regulation megawatts is so less, 400 megawatts. So we don't really see that much potential for it in our production cost models at this time.
And one of the questions I do want to ask our staff too is, do we take that into consideration in certificate of need process for transmission? If they are looking at a need for the transmission, are they also considering that storage elements that are kind of popping up into the marketplace now? Is that part of that consideration? Frankly, I don't even know.
Sure, and I think just to add on to that, not specifically on the certificate of need or the individual state proceedings. In terms of the FERC Order 1000 itself, we do have an obligation to study the non-transmission alternatives, which could include demand response, energy storage, and the like. But nevertheless, we should continue to look at other options.
All right, we have a Minnesota-based question. Will the PUC's grid modernization effort look closely at storage and how it could improve the grid?
Well, I wish Commissioner Lang was here because she could answer that better than I could. So the answer is I think there's a lot of things that we'll be looking at. I know out of the last rate case, there was a pricing kind of model being pushed for some of the environmental advocates. It was similar to a kind of a price and time model, and when we did kind of send that off to the Commission to study that, or to the Department of Commerce, excuse me, to study those concepts of changing the way we have retail pricing for electricity. So those things will be studied, I think, a little closer. I think as we see other markets develop, Germany, California, when we start seeing some of these prices come down, I think there will be a lot of consideration for how we look at and price those things within to the grid. One other thing that I think was critical too with the community solar garden discussion was the fact that now Xcel is really taking a serious look at how power flows back up into the system. I don't think they've ever really looked at that closely. I think they've talked about it, but now they're actually having to do it. It's a practical, real thing. They're going to have megawatts out there pushing back at the system, and their engineers are starting to take a look at how that looks, and that was a big part of the discussion in the community solar gardens, is how that system will be able to handle it. That system that was basically lots of power being thrown out into the system, moving out to the branches. Now what does it look like if we have some of the branches out that are pushing power back? And so their engineers are studying that, and I think that will be of some value as we start to try to integrate storage into the process. So I think we are looking at some of those things, but I can honestly say I don't think they're as coordinated as I think we need to have them so that they take advantage of storage.
All right, we have another regional question. With regard to the proposed load growth in the next 5 to 10 years in MISO's territory. So does MISO anticipate requirements for additional energy in the next 5 to 10 years versus what we already have?
I believe right now in our market, we are seeing growth in the south part of our footprint. They're calling it industrial renaissance in Louisiana and other parts of the footprint. So they are, the utilities down there, Entergy specifically is looking to upgrade some of their transmission systems to accommodate that load growth. But in the next 5-10 years, we just did a survey with the organization of MISO states around our resource shortfall issue, given the impacts on our grid with the Clean Power Plan, and we found currently we do have projections that would keep us above the reserve margin. Remember, in our footprint we have 15% thereabout. In the question related to Europe and the like, they have substantially higher reserve margins because of their reliance on solar and other areas, so that could be a factor as well. But definitely we are seeing enough generation loads and resources in the next 5 years. But beyond that, we are still projecting a shortfall. So I hope I answered your question.
Another Minnesota question. Minnesota recently concluded a value of solar tariff proceeding. Why couldn't we do something similar for storage to determine the elements of the value stack? Question, anyone can answer the question. Or not. Or our commissioner.
I don't see why not.
Good.
I think so. It's difficult is I think the answer. That's the problem, that there are different ways people are trying to value storage, but it's really site specific. It's harder to generalize, I think, than solar is. So it's a great idea, but it is hard to put into practice.
And one of the things with storage, when you're thinking about it from a public policy point of view, is it can help you accomplish a lot of different goals. It can help you accomplish carbon reduction goals. It could help you accomplish resiliency goals. And a lot of that depends on how you value it and where you put it in your system. You could put a battery near a coal plant and help keep that coal plant running for a longer period, and that would, so from an environmental perspective, that wouldn't be good. So a lot of it is where you want it to be sited and how you want to use it.
This also goes to the generation transmission distribution issue that we were talking about earlier, which is that because it's at each of those points in the system, and those different systems do valuation differently, so that ends up coming into the study. One potential place that energy law could learn from property law here is that there have been some really interesting innovations happening in the takings jurisprudence around just compensation in the climate change context. So New Jersey had a case where it was essentially, everybody recognized there was a physical taking. It was a sand dune project, but they were originally going to get, like 300 grand plus in compensation, because that was the amount of physical property lost. But they ended up getting $1, in the settlement, and the basic reason why was that they said that you had to take the benefits into account that they were getting from the sand dunes in deciding how much they should be compensated for the property loss. And so some of these various benefits that people are talking about, I mean, that's what potentially makes the valuation tricky in this context, is that if you think about all the different kinds of things that storage can do in generation, transmission, distribution, and then our typical ways of valuing that, then you'd have to put it against costs. And so I think there's some really interesting opportunities there.
All right. Another question that's somewhat Minnesota-based. And the question is, will the PUC be able to bring energy storage into the current conversation going on with regard to solar gardens? And are those two related in any way, or can they be?
I think they can be. I mean, it's a struggle. Obviously, the solar garden program was put out to us to obviously create solar gardens for communities, and so we're struggling just with the parameters of how that works in the appropriate price points to make sure it is working for its intended purpose of helping communities who do not have access to good solar locations to be able to invest in solar and not be necessarily an arbitrage situation for large entities who are trying to flatten out the cost of their power. And so that's a big struggle in and of itself. I mean, it's a beast that is going to be difficult for the PUC to get their heads around to make sure that we're doing this program effectively. I think the ancillary effect is, though, that we'll start discovering more about what our grid can do, and if there is some way to integrate in their sensible pricing so that we encourage, I guess for lack of a better term, cogeneration of solar and storage, then that's something we should be considering. But it hasn't been part of what has been brought to us as that quasi-judicial person who needs to figure out what's fair in that situation.
So I said before I was going to leave the last 5 minutes for closing remarks, but I think I'm not going to do that because we have a lot of good questions remaining and everyone's getting a chance to talk in the Q&A, so I'm just going to keep going with questions for our last 5 minutes. And this next one is MISO related, and the question is MISO planning to reform market access limitations? I think that was discussed during some of the opening presentations, the 5 megawatt threshold, single location requirement, and if so, what is the timing, and if not, why not?
I believe we are, and the forum for that is this program called Market Enhancement Program, where we are putting all the market ideas in this hopper, basically, and asking for stakeholders for their support, because the last thing we want to do is go chase a market product that only a segment of our stakeholder community want. So we have all these ideas articulated in this market vision process. So the market enhancement program, which executes on that market vision process, is going to be the place to capture and work with the stakeholders on it.
All right, a more technical question for the panel. Given that DG inverters include capacitor technology that can provide ancillary services, how do you think storage can deliver the most value? For instance, what type of scenarios?
Was that one left over for the technical guys earlier? I don't know.
No, it says question for the rules panel on the top.
Well, I'm improving my barrier right now. I didn't even know what you asked the question was. So.
Anyone?
I'm not really up on capacitors that much, but as I said, there are a lot of different things storage can do, and the important thing going forward for trying to get the best value out of these is going to be the management software, which we actually haven't talked about a lot in this, but that's becoming the real important thing. So it can provide all these different things, and there may be more value in this or that, and the intermediate software that determines where the most value is for the storage to be acting at that time is going to be really important going forward, and there's a lot of companies trying to get that right now.
I think we have time for one more question. Does changing the dialogue to overall system efficiency improve the prospects for storage versus policies that look at energy efficiency or renewals or storage separately?
So I think, you know, one of the advantages of that kind of a framing is that it lets us sidestep politics more, right? And anything that lets us, I mean, one of the things I think that sometimes can get poisonous about our political dialogue about energy transition is that if you listen to the news media, you'd think that we disagree on almost everything across the parties. And in fact, I think people agree on more than they disagree on. And one of the things that I think is and this goes to sort of this question of framing, you know, in the same sense that, you know, nobody likes the power to go out, right? Republicans and Democrats both value being able to power their homes and their devices. You know, and you saw a lot of sort of bilateral, bipartisan cooperation happening, you know, after Superstorm Sandy, et cetera, around grid resiliency. I think in a similar way, there's an opportunity around storage to make it about making the system better, more cost-effective, et cetera, that are I think really bipartisan values. So I think some of that framing around efficiency can be really useful in terms of the politics around this and treating it as sort of a grid improvement in a variety of ways.
I think if your overall frame was that this is about carbon, then I would agree with reshaping it in that fashion, because that becomes the political kind of lightning rod that's in the room a lot of times. So I think there's so many other ways to reshape this argument that are so meaningful, both from a reliability standpoint, from a local industrial and also economic standpoint for the state of Minnesota, that I think you have so many options to really shape your arguments in a lot of different ways that you can win. I think that's what, if I look at this in my old world when I had the lobbyist hat on, I'm spinning through different ways of messaging this one so that can be so effective in so many different avenues. I just wouldn't throw out any of them outside of trying to make this about carbon, even though carbon will help you sell it amongst a set of folks. Where it really wins, I think, in Minnesota is around creating jobs and keeping the economic development. Here, it's our energy. We have wind, we have sun, we don't have coal, we don't have gas. And so this is about Minnesota jobs, keeping the dollars here for the energy produced here, keeping that in the economy and keeping it spinning. And I think that you can start talking about how storage plays into that. You start to really have a good winning argument, I think, with policymakers. It's just a matter of really shaping that message and honing it.
And in the energy partisanship research we've done, it's very much borne out that when you get real economic benefits that you can demonstrate in measurable ways, you can get bipartisan support.
All right, we are out of time, so please thank our panelists.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind everyone that we have a booklet called Energy Storage 101 that talks about some of the very issues you're hearing on these panels, definitions of ancillary services, et cetera, glossaries, and so on.